Everyone. Uh, just wanted to say hello and a lovely Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon, 2:17. So today, I just we're going to be going over chapter 6 and 7. We're going to be talking a little bit about the rise of biblical tradition. As in the last lecture, I'll be kind of focusing a little bit on the some of the philosophy as well as the religious principles that a lot of the artists and sculptors really want to focus on. And that's what I want to focus on today. So let's go and if you could turn to your page, turn to your book in chapter 6, and you should see in the sacrifice of Isaac, I believe. So the very first thing that we have to understand when it comes to Judaism and Christianity is that it's really both religions are religions of sacrifice. So we talked a little bit about Buddhism. We talked about Hinduism. We also talked about some of the Greco-Roman, as well as some of the Greek and Egyptian culture. How there was varying gods who were fighting one another and then trying to find a balance after that. So now we get to talk a little bit about what's maybe a little bit more familiar for all of us, which is monotheistic religions, where there is only one God. So one thing that makes Christianity and Judaism very distinct from a lot of these other gods is that Christianity and Judaism assume that God is separate from us in the sense that he is outside of us. One philosopher, one theologian, Otto, I think Rudolf Otto, would describe God as wholly other, not Holy, but Wholly, in the sense that God is very distinct from humanity. And what you read in the Bible that may describe God, say for example, like in the Psalms, it describes God as like a dove who gathers his children. Jesus often describes God in fatherly terms, stuff like that. Biblical authors often assume that that was more anthropomorphic language, and anthropomorphic just means anthro, man type language, describing how we see things to describe what God might be like. But the Hebraic as well as Christian authors had an assumption that that language is always very limited, that God is both separate but also and distinct from who we are. So unlike a lot of the gods that we've been talking about that were very human-like, the God of the Hebrew and Christian Bible is distinct. He's not like us. So that's the very first assumption that we have to understand about Elohim, I guess is the Hebrews described it as God, or Adonai, or in some Christian contexts, Yahweh, or the Trinity. Of course, they have Jews and Christians have a different idea of God being triune, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's the very first thing I think that we have to assume is that the Hebrew Bible, when it first starts, it assumes that God is separate from creation, first and foremost. He's not dependent on it. Theologians talked about the aseity of God, Aseity, the aseity of God being that he does not, in a sense, need humanity to make him happy. He does not need people to somehow please him. He's pleased within himself in the sense that he creates out of his own pleasure. And so that was very important for the writers because they wanted to understand that God, again, if he's not like us, he creates things out of his own pleasure, that he's not somehow utterly dependent. He's not up there kind of like really, really hoping people will sacrifice to him so he gets better. The Hebraic and Christian assumption is that God loves out of his own heart, out of his own compassion, but he's not utterly dependent on humanity, which is extremely distinct and very, very different from the other things that the other religions that we have looked at thus far, all the way up to Hinduism. Again, Buddhism is less of a religion and more of a philosophy. So, the first, and so how do we know God in the Bible? Well, it's through revelation. And revelation just literally means the veils of your own eyes are coming off. The Hebrew Bible would assume that we can't really know anything about who this God is if he's separate from us unless he reveals himself to us. And he has to reveal himself to us in order for us to understand him. Otherwise, we're just kind of making guesses. And when we make guesses, we make these things called idols, which you'll see in the first two commandments in the Ten Commandments, says for us not to do. Because when we look to ourselves, we look to other people, when we're confused, we make things that don't necessarily represent God, like oxes or snakes or various animals, or maybe images of ourselves. And those are all far, far representations of who God really is. So therefore, people are lost. People are sinful. Again, I'm using these kind of assumptions. People are without hope until God reveals himself to people through the word grace, through the word covenant, through the word mercy. And then when he does, he then enters in this kind of relationship with them. And when he enters in a relationship with them, he then brings them through a place of redemption. And then through that redemption, guides them, protects them, but also at times disciplines them, much like a father would or in a kind of parental somewhat in a parental way. So those are all the assumptions. It's really it's extremely unique, because not only does it respect the aseity or the otherness of God, but it also respects the fact that God is not dependent on us, but that God's love is from himself, or from his own being. So the very first prophet that we see in the Bible is Abraham. Abraham was the very first prophet that was called from God in the Bible, described after Adam and Eve fell from the garden. They were cast away from the garden. The Genesis writer, after the creation, talks about the people then are kind of wandering upon the earth, and then there's this giant flood. I forgot Noah was also kind of in a covenant with God as well, but I'm just going to jump right to Abraham. Abraham is considered really the father of all the different religions of the world, because Abraham was the first one that really kind of builds this covenantal relationship with God based on faith. And so one thing that you're going to see within Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam is that that a relationship with God is dependent on sacrifice. It's not utterly dependent on sacrifice and works, but it's more dependent on some kind of faith, some kind of an assumption that God is one. So Abraham is going to be the first one to really bring out the monotheism, that there is only one God, to these particular group of people, very unique group of people. So you could read a little bit of Abraham's relationship. The author talks about that a little bit. But one thing that we have to understand, we also have to understand about the Hebrew text, is that it's broken up in a variety of parts. So you have the period of the patriarchs, the period of the Exodus, period of the conquest. So when God enters into a relationship with Abraham, one thing that he promises him is that I will make your stars as numerous, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven. And so God promises to Abraham, because he believes in him, because he offers his own son, Isaac, as a sacrifice. God that says don't do that. Through that act of faith, God then says to Abraham, I'm going to promise you a nation. I'm going to promise you a nation of so many people that you can't even count. And so through that promise, Abraham then starts having a child. He has his first child after Isaac. And Abraham was extremely old at this time. And it was such a miracle. Hebrew authors considered it as a pure miracle that God would choose Abraham, who was way beyond age, in his 90s. And then God gives him the capability to have childbirth. And then through that child, many, many, many nations come from Abraham's inheritance or seed. And that's where the Jews really believe that their line, that the direct line, is really through the line of Isaac. Now the Muslims are going to take a different view. They're going to actually say that we also come from Abraham's seed, but they would believe that they come from the line of Ishmael. That's going to be actually the main difference between Islam and Judaism. Judaism assumes that they're the true heirs, because Isaac was the son that God had promised Abraham. Abraham, of course, gets a little impatient and whatnot, and then he has a son quickly to a woman that's not his wife, a concubine, and then that son's name is Ishmael. And Jews really believe that Isaac is the true heir, whereas Muslims believe that Ishmael is a true heir because he was the first one. So that's giving me a little bit of the thing. But one thing that they both have one way that the Jews and the Muslims, one commonality between the two is that they both believe that Abraham is the father of many nations. And so the Jews, so I'm just going to talk about biblical history. The Jews then come from Isaac, and then they eventually grow up to about 70 people with Jacob, and then they create from Jacob the story of Joseph, and then Jacob's family, which consists of about 70 to 80 people, then go down. They live in Egypt for about 400 years, and the next thing you know, they've built a nation of about several million people. And that's really the start of Judaism, was through Abraham believing in God. Monotheistic religion is then formed. Isaac and his seed then with Jacob, and then Jacob going down to Egypt, and then as when they're living in Egypt, primarily as slaves, growing to be a humongous nation, and then God coming in and saying, "You really are my people, because I made this promise to your great grandfather Abraham. Therefore, I'm going to deliver you from Egypt." And that's the whole story of the Exodus. And then God enters this relationship with Israel and says, "Because you are my people, you are to follow my laws, i.e. the Ten Commandments." And then the whole Bible is really this struggle. Really, Israel means in Hebrew, Israel, which means struggle or wrestle. Comes from the word, much like Jacob, their father. And through all the biblical texts, all in the Old Testament, it's really about God struggling with his own people. Sometimes he gets upset with them. Sometimes he casts them away through the exile. But then he always brings them back, always has them return. And the reason why he casts them away is because they continue to break his covenants, continue to break his laws. But first and foremost, God's love, his hesed love, his covenantal love, endures, and he continues to rescue them over and over and over again. So the biblical history of, especially the Old Testament, is this beautiful history of redemption through people that are really messed up and fallen. And that's really what leads to what we find in Christianity as well, is that Jesus is the greatest Messiah. He is the God-man. He's the greatest prophet. He comes and then offers that sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice for people, and then he leads all people, not just Jewish people, but Gentiles as well, into a relationship with him. So it's this continual line. And so the first and foremost thing of Christianity, I'm jumping a little ahead, but the first and foremost, if I could remind you, it's that God has to reveal himself to you. And then when God reveals himself to you through his word, God then gives a covenant with you. And then he sends prophets and priests and other people along the way to remind these people of the covenant. And then finally in Christianity, it's formed, or the apogee of the Hebraic religion is formed by the sending of his son, who then comes as the God-man, who then tells people how to live, but then he gives himself, because he is God and man, and then all people believe in him. God's love is not just to a particular group of people, but for all the world. And so the story of, the reason why I go into all of that is because the story of the Bible, and the story is God is one, God loves, God has to reveal, and that God redeems. And so those are really the stories of God's love for people. And all the different texts that we read is really about those things. So we go into, if you could look at, so that's the assumption, those struggles and whatnot, and the redemption and all the other things. So when you go into, for example, William Blake, the book of Job, which is, it's William Blake in 6.3. Job is a very important text because it brings up all of those themes that I just had been talking about. It also brings up the themes of theodicy, in the sense of why is there so much evil in the world? If God is good, if God is separate, if God loves, why is there so much evil? But God continues to bring this relationship with his people. And so I take a water from that. What you see is all of the different texts, not just texts, but pieces and details in the synagogues, reconstructions, and all the paintings are basically a regurgitation of the themes that I had just talked about. And so Christianity then takes the Jewish religion and it spreads. And one of the main reasons why it spreads is because of the Apostle Paul, who had preach to people that it wasn't just to a particular group of people, but it was actually for everybody. It was for the poor, it was for the barbarian, it was for Greeks, it was for the Jews, it was for everyone. And so his message was actually extremely universal, which at the time, it sounds, somewhat democratic today and something that we probably are used to hearing today. But Christianity spread like wildfire back then, because one thing that you have to assume about a lot of these different religions is that there were a lot of the religions were very based on parochial or genealogical assumptions. In other words, it was a religion of your great 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 grandfather, and there wasn't so much a whole lot of conversion back then. It was more like my rich person. So say for example, if you're born into a very rich family, the assumption was is that your gods kind of protected you on this caste or in this on this very high order, and but you gave other poor people their particular gods for them, but they weren't quite as powerful as your gods if you were rich and if you were wealthy. Paul then comes along, the Apostle Paul, and he says, no, God is God of everyone. And that just because you are rich or just because you're wealthy, your God is not somehow more powerful than my God. God is one, and that God, and this is what made Christianity so much unique, more unique than Judaism, is that Judaism assumed that it was only for a particular group of people, so it wouldn't really focus a lot on conversion, or evangelizing a lot of other groups. It would Christianity would have a very simple message, and it included all different types of people and all different types of backgrounds to worship this God. And the assumption of Christianity is that God loved the poor and just as much as he loved the rich. In fact, if anything, Jesus could be very harsh with very rich people. In fact, some of his harshest language was with people who were very self-righteous, people who were very prideful, people who were very important in society. That was extremely unique when Jesus did that, because again, the assumptions in the ancient Near East world were, if you're rich, if you're wealthy, if you got a lot of money, gods must be smiling on you. And Jesus comes along and he actually twists that, completely turns that around. He says, no, actually, if you love money and if you're doing really, really well for yourself, God actually could be frowning on you. And Jesus in the Beatitudes said, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are those peacemakers. In other words, he's basically completely reversing the social economic structure, the assumptions of the time, and saying you've got it totally wrong. It's actually backwards. So really kind of interesting. And you can imagine the majority of the people, who were they? They weren't rich. The majority of the people living in that time, 98% of them were likely living off of like our equivalent of maybe $10, $5 a month. So they're very, very impoverished. And of course, they just loved this message. It just spread all around the world. And so this idea of God's love for them, this is where we understand the concept of fish. So now that message, though, let me kind of back up. So the message was also very offensive to a lot of the Roman citizens, the Roman guard. It was very offensive to people who were wealthy, obviously, because they didn't feel like they had the same power as they used to have, and so therefore a lot of Christians endured an amazing amount of suffering, amazing amount of persecution for the first 400 years. And what's so interesting about the message of Christianity is that the more they persecuted, the more it actually spread, because the people who were poor completely outpopulated the angry, very rich people, okay, who or powerful people, I should say that, who really hated the message. And the more they persecuted, the more other people kind of liked it even more. It was just it was something that was very ironic that happened. Now, eventually Christianity, through government intervention, in a sense, Constantinople and was not Constantinople, but Constantine, excuse me, and Christianity then became quite popular. Over time, Christianity was actually the religion that the predominant religion in all of Europe, and as well as many countries in Africa, until the rise of Islam. So if you jump to the end of your book, Christianity was being formed in countries that allowed it to be formed. Christian churches were very ornamental, but one of they wanted many of their churches had some basic structures to it. They had an atrium, a nathrix, a nave, and an apse. In other words, if you look at all the churches, it's if you look on page 223, 613, a lot of the churches built at that time represented basically a cross. So when you look at all these churches, these old churches, one thing that you can see with all the churches is basically built like this. So there's a cross. So the apse is where my finger is. You could actually, rather than seeing, just look at 223. That's kind of the head of the cross. That's actually where people would worship. If you look, the arms of the cross would be the transept. So that's where the choir would actually gather. And then if you look at the nave, that's where the people would then gather. The people would then walk to, and then they would reach the aisle on the very, very side. And the nave is where the procession was. And then people would actually come through the atrium. And the nathrix is where you would cleanse yourself. In Catholic churches, I go to an Anglican church, for example. So what we do before we actually enter, we put our hand through the water. We cleanse ourselves like that before we enter a place that's considered holy. And so they would do that in the same way. So if you notice the way of the cross, it's kind of giving testimony, not testimony, but it's witnessing basically to the life of Christ. So you're going through the nave, and then you're sitting on the aisle, actually on the side of the cross. Hopefully you're carrying, and then the preacher is actually preaching with two people that are sitting, actually carrying with him the message, and he is the one that's considered at the head, but he's speaking literally through the Bible, and he's speaking what the words of Christ are for these people who are also helping carry the cross. And the church, as you can see, everyone, whether it's the choir, whether it's the minister, whether it's the people in the aisle, they're all part of the whole community of the cross. There's nobody that's like way above, as we saw earlier in the ziggurats. The ziggurats were where the gods would then come down and the priests were way down here. The assumption was that everyone was actually on one equal level, and everyone was part of carrying the cross of the Christian message. So it was a message that was highly influential amongst a lot of people because of its assumption of equality. All right, so I want to jump into chapter 7. That's kind of the history of Christianity. Chapter 7 is pretty philosophical. I won't spend a whole lot of time here. It just basically shows how Christianity formed. Two things that actually caused the transformation of Rome. One thing that you have to understand is that, as you can see, that the message just becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. But for the first 300 to 400 years, Rome was still predominant pagan. Eventually, Rome then kind of ends up fighting way too many battles, and it kind of loses its power from within. And so a Christian emperor, Justinian, as well as Constantine, they actually end up becoming Christian, and there are many Christian philosophers that would then write on what proper Christianity would look like. And a lot of that would be through the Nicene Creed, which had an assumption which stated that God was that God had sent His Son, and that God and Christ were equal, and that really proposed the element of the Trinity. So then so I'm going a little too fast, sorry. So when Christianity started spreading, there were lots of sects of Christianity that actually disagreed with one another quite a bit. So there are certain people who call themselves Christians that were, quote, Arians, and the Arians were much like actually modern day Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Arian theologians and Christians were people that assumed that Christ was not God, that Christ was just a man like just a normal guy. He was a very special person, but he was not anybody that was to be worshipped. And that the Arians were eventually kind of driven out, I guess you could say, by a significant, I guess, Orthodox Christians, a number of Christians who would say that that's a, quote, heretical view, and that if you don't see that Christ is God, then therefore you can't be saved. They believed that, if you don't assume that Jesus is God, you're still there's no mediator, I guess you could say, between yourself and this God who's up here revealed. There's an assumption that because Jesus would actually say a lot of things through his miracles and whatnot that claimed that he was divine. And so it was a big controversy that came out, and then it was eventually solved, per se, through the Council of Nicaea, through the Arian controversy, in that Orthodox Christians, mainly through Alexandria, believed that God, the Son, was fully divine and fully human. So here's the other thing too. There are also a lot of Christian sects that believe that Jesus was God, but he wasn't fully human. So he was just kind of like a ghost, somewhat. He was like a spiritual guy. He was a super, super spiritual man. And this is where some of the Gnostic heresies, I call it heresies. That's what they call them. Just basically something that's not orthodox. The Gnostic assumption would be that God was God. He was a type of God, but he wasn't a true man. And so a lot of these things were eventually, I guess, solved through the Nicene Creed, because the Nicene Creed said, no, God is both. He is not just a guy. He's actually God, and he's not just a God. He's also a full man. And so that's what they would call the incarnation, or the incarnation of God, that God actually incarnates into a full human. And that's something that really makes that Christianity totally unique from any other religion in the world, is because that is where you have the God that's up in the clouds. He's wholly other, he's separate, and then he becomes like just one of us. He's tempted, but he doesn't fall. He knows what it's like to have temptations. He knows what it's like to be really, really hungry. He knows what it's like to be really lonely. He knows what it's like to be angry. He knows what it's like to be kind of a little confused, at times. Actually says in the Bible that Jesus says, I'm not really sure what time that's going to come. They're talking about the end times. He gets hungry. He falls asleep at times. He gets tired. He actually falls asleep when the disciples are freaking out when there's a huge storm in the middle of the ocean. He's just kind of like sleeping, and he wakes up and he's like, "Why, you guys don't have any faith?" And then he calms the storm, which is really quite a beautiful message. I mean, here's this guy, he's falling asleep, and there's this basically a hurricane, and then he gets up, wakes up, and he, by his word, he just says, "Okay, yeah, be still." All of a sudden, the whole sea is totally still. So he's fully human. He's asleep on the bed, and then he's God. So that's where the assumption of Christianity is that it's both. It's the incarnation where it's both, and that's where Christianity is very unique. Another reason why it just kind of spread quite a bit, because it seemed safe, but it seemed profound at the same time. One of my favorite stories is Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Aslan, the lion, and Peter, I think, asks the beavers, Mr. Beaver, and he says, is Aslan? And they get like really, really excited. And Aslan is actually a representation of Christ in a lot of ways. C.S. Lewis actually purposely did that. And they get kind of afraid in a little bit. And then he asks Mr. Beaver, is Aslan safe? And the beaver was like, no, Aslan's not safe. But he's good. And so that's the concept of Christ in a lot of ways. I mean, in a sense, he's safe, but he's not. But he's extremely good. So it's both. It's both utterly profound, and then you have people like Mary Magdalene, who were considered very, very kind of the quote scum of the society, would come to him because she had done a lot of bad things, and just cry at his feet, and he would lift her up and hug her and just wipe her tears away. So he was very, very, very human. He loved children, all these wonderful things, and yet he went into temples and got a whip and just like whipped all the Pharisees out. And he terrified certain people, and then he would love the most humblest person that you and I probably would never talk to. It was just really a beautiful and profound message. So I won't get emotional, but it's just so that's Christianity. And so these messages, though, so one thing that Christianity that does is that there's this sense of irony, the profound and yet the profane, in a sense. Not profane like dirty, but just the God and then the man, all of these things. So there's this sense of tension, I guess, in Christianity that's different. And so that's where you see quite an influx of art, because art is really the experience of tension. That's where art thrives, when there has to be tension. One of my favorite writers is Flannery O'Connor, and one of the reasons why I love Flannery O'Connor. In fact, I love Southern writers in general, because Southern writers, Southern writers get something that I think a lot of Northern writers don't get. Southern writers, there's this Christ hauntedness in the South, in the sense that Christ isn't really there, but he's haunted there. It's like he's haunting the place. So I love Flannery O'Connor's words. So when you read the literature of Southern writing, things like affairs or hypocrisy is extremely predominant in a lot of Southern writing. And the reason why there's such a tension in a lot of Southern writing is because it's done in the facade of kind of like Christian culture. And so when you read these Southern writers, they really put up this kind of, the culture is very Christian, is very holy in a lot of ways, but in another way, it seems there's this element of emptiness as well. So the point I'm trying to make is that you get this beautiful artwork from all sources of tension. And so Christianity really thrives on that, because you have tension wherever you go. You have God loving, and then God at the time getting very angry. You have God saving, and then also God casting away. You have God as God, and Christ as God, and yet God is human. All of these things, which then profoundly influences the way we view art. And so you get a variety of different themes in all of the churches. So chapter 7 actually doesn't have a whole lot of pieces that we could really look at. I mean, you have the Christ as the Good Shepherd. Again, Christianity is interesting because you see a lot of, look at the difference between 7.6 and 7.10. This is the other thing that you see in a lot of Christian sculpture and scripture Christian architecture, is that you look at 7.10. I mean, the interior of the Hagia Sophia. I mean, you just want to. I mean, it's just, you see the light coming down in gold structures and on the penitentives and the domes and all of these other things, where the weight is actually at the side rather than the top. You have these mathematical proportions of order and all of these other things. Light kind of coming down where it just seems so translucent. And yet you compare that to 7.6, where it's a very simple, kind of like some of the stuff that we saw with Buddhism, very kind of simple, simplistic. The diametric elements are, for the most part, two-dimensional. There's not really an element of space, something that so that's also where you're going to see a lot of Christian art. It's going to be, you're going to have something like the Sistine Chapel, and little documents that just kind of have a little tiny fish, and a guy just kind of eating a fish. So that's the thing with Christianity, is that it has a lot of ironic tension within it. And what the other thing that you'll see is that each of the architectural churches all have kind of a story to them. I kind of explained the cross, but they also have story in the sense of kind of like an apex. Like the apse is really kind of like an apex of where the Christian religion expresses itself. So that's pretty much all I have for the lesson, but thank you guys, and I look forward to seeing you soon.